Welcome back to Strength Happens. Today's episode is a deeply personal one. And in honor of Feeding Tube Awareness Week, we're sharing our stories as moms who've walked this journey in different ways. Both of our daughters have had feeding tubes. Morgan's has been lifelong, and Hallie's was during infancy, early childhood. And we're talking about what led to those decisions, the emotions that came with accepting those decisions, and what these tubes have taught us along the way.
If you're a parent navigating feeding challenges, considering a G tube, or simply wanting to understand this world better, you're not alone. This conversation is for you. As Janine said, we're acknowledging Feeding Tube Awareness Week, but with this episode, because as Janine mentioned, we both have children with feeding tubes. Hallie started with an NG tube at birth, and then it was taken out, and then she got a G tube from 5 months to 5 years, and then she also had a G tube her last year of life. Feeding tubes really changed the way both of us parented, the way we fed our daughters. Basic nutrition is such an integral part and such a connection, and we had to learn new ways of trusting ourselves with that connection and with that purpose of being a mom and taking care of our kids.
Think there's so much emphasis put on the bonding when you're
Yes.
nursing or you're bottle feeding. It's that bonding moment that you get with your baby. So I imagine that was a big adjustment.
Yeah, since Hallie's was from birth, when she was born, she had what we call an NG tube. So it's a small yellow tube that went in through her nose, and then it would go down the trachea into the stomach. And a piece of it would be taped to the side of her face. And we connected a big syringe to that yellow tube. And then the milk would go through her nose into her stomach. And they had to teach us, like, you hold a baby and put the binky in their mouth so they get that sucking, and then you
Mhm.
pour the milk in. It's a lot more coordination than breastfeeding or bottle feeding because you're holding the baby, you're putting the binking in, you're holding the tube, you're putting the syringe on, and you're pouring the milk in slowly, and you're trying to get them to suck while they get that satiation in their stomach.
So do they not do continuous feeds, like, as an infant, it's just a
She
like a
had both.
syringe?
She had both. She had continuous feeds at night, and then we did boluses during the day. And for her, Hallie was a little stinker. We had home nursing, and she was on an apnea monitor. We had a feeding pump, and we had boluses. But for her, when she would drink, she would choke on the milk, and it would go into her lungs, which they call frank aspiration. And so they said, we're going to keep the NG tube in for, a few weeks and see how it does. So we did that, and then she started to swallow safely, and so they said, "Oh, she's fine to go on a bottle." And then she kept choking on the bottle, and then she had a real bad choking episode where she stopped breathing. And so that one took her to the hospital, and she was admitted for about 2 weeks. She was about 2 months old at the time, and at that time, they did another swallow study, and she was not swallowing safely again. So they put the NG tube back, and our stinker little Hallie used to like to pull the NG tube
Of course
out
they did.
always around 3 AM, and we weren't trained at the time how to replace the NG tube because you wanna make sure you don't put an NG tube in the airway. So we'd
Mhm.
have to take her to the ER, and then at 3 months old, she started swallowing safely again, and they sent us home on the bottle and took the NG tube out. And between 3 to 5 months, I'd feed her, and I'd feel like she was choking, and they kept telling me I was anxious, and it was all my perception. And finally, she started having bradycardic episodes where her apnea monitor would show her heart rate was low every time she'd bottle feed, and then she'd cough and choke. And they admitted her that time with the bradycardic episode, and they did a swallow study again. And at that time, it was determined that she was frank aspirating and getting pneumonia. And so at 5 months old, she got her first G tube placed. It was a very difficult thing to do because I remember the night before the surgery, John lifted up her little pajamas and said, "Take a picture. This is the last time her belly won't have a scar." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, you're so right. This is gonna change
Yeah.
her whole life." It was either you stay alive with a feeding tube or
Mhm.
you don't. So we knew it had to be done, but I remember we had this little picture moment with John holding her with her little
Mhm.
belly. And she actually had something called a Nissen funduplication because her muscle at the top of her stomach wasn't working. So the same time they placed the feeding tube, they also tied the top of her stomach and created a sphincter muscle to keep
Mm.
her from refluxing. So it was a major surgery for her, and you get the Foley catheter that comes out. It's a longer tube out of the stomach until that skin tissue heals. and then after it heals, they put in something called a Mickey button, which we always tell people is like a beach ball opening,
Right.
and then you can attach tubes and do boluses. She did do the pump at night where she'd have continuous feeds, and then during the day, she would have boluses.
Yeah.
But it was always an adventure, it was never easy, but, it's all about nutrition, and
They're infants, and that's all they rely on is milk.
exactly, exactly, and you have to get it in. It was life or death for hers. Do you remember
Yeah.
some of the signs of when Morgan needed to have a feeding tube placed? Because she was a little older than Hallie, right?
Yeah, she was about 18 months when we even first started to have those conversations. When she was little, I nursed her till she was over a year old.
She latched on and was able to eat safely and
Well, we thought that's what was happening, but now looking back, I think that I overproduced, and as soon as there was any pressure, I think I just spilled in her mouth because she doesn't have really good oral motor muscle control. She never took a binky. She never sucked. So I was wondering when you were saying that as an infant, that with Hallie to trigger that swallow, I wonder if Morgan would have been able to do that. So I was pregnant with Matthew and nursing was hurting and we were supplementing with cereals and baby food and stuff. So it wasn't like she was exclusively on breast milk, but she never really took like from the little sippy cups and stuff. She just
yeah,
didn't really we had to take valves out so that it would just kind of pour in her
pour
mouth,
in her
but then if
mouth.
it became too much, she would choke. So
We had the little cutaway cup when Hallie could finally swallow safely.
see, and her fine motor skills were so poor that she had a really hard time doing any of those things.
Yeah.
So we struggled. We tried all different things. We were in feeding therapy from an early age just because of the tongue control and her oral motor issues. So we got a lot of that, but it wasn't until I completely took her off nursing completely that we started to notice that her weight was falling off
Yeah.
because up until maybe 10 months, she was kind of a chunky baby. She was very
Aw, I've
round. Her
seen
face was
pictures
very
of her,
round. It's
yeah.
so weird to think because she's so not chunky at all. So for her, she got sick and she got extremely dehydrated. So we ended up going to the hospital and they were like, "Oh, she's extremely dehydrated." So, through that process, as they were hydrating her and doing all her labs, they were noticing that her kidney numbers were off. And it took a couple days to get her, so she was pretty stable. But when we first showed up, they couldn't find a vein, and they ended up putting her IV through her head up
I
here.
remember those,
And
Hallie had one of those.
I had never seen that. But it was our first hospital stay too that we ever
Oh,
had.
really?
So yeah, and the funny thing is she was scheduled to get a feeding tube the week after. She was already
Really?
on the books. We had already decided that, yes, it was time to do the feeding tube, and then she ended up in the hospital, and then they determined that she had something called renal tubular acidosis during that stay. So they thought that was contributing to why she was failure to thrive. So they were like, well, we can probably hold off on the feeding tube now that we can treat the condition. Maybe that will help her
Gain weight at that point.
gain weight because it was all with the imbalance of the acid in in her body. Her kidneys were expelling the acid into her body
What?
versus processing it through her
Poor thing.
urine.
Mhm.
So we just worked on getting her stabilized, um, and we went home with more feeding therapy, and we just tried to let her gain weight. And we just didn't do the feeding tube at that time. So it was a while longer before we got to that point.
You mentioned feeding therapy, and I'm like, Hallie was in feeding therapy from the time she was 3 months old because strengthening that cheek and that jaw,
Yep.
strengthening the low tone, doing the sour swabs in her mouth to get her working on moving her tongue around, all those things you hope will help in so
Yeah.
many ways. It's like all these flashbacks to,
Yeah, little
um
vibrating ghosts and
yeah,
interesting
to
things that
yeah,
you're
they're
putting in.
so creative. Feeding therapists became such a part of our lives, we did OT, PT, and speech and feeding therapy for so many
Yeah.
years. When Hallie was 3.5, she finally was able to eat safely, and we went to a feeding program where she went from 100% tube fed to 0% tube fed in
Mhm.
2 weeks, but I was so scared. We put the medicine through the feeding tube. We put the Pedialyte when she got sick, it was a safety net. So,
Yeah.
it took us another 2 years before we even took it out. I think she was 5 or 6 before we took it out, but
I
probably
think
about
it's
the time
scary.
yeah, she probably got hers out about the time a little after Morgan got hers placed. Wasn't
Yeah,
Morgan was
because Morgan was around 3 to 4 when we finally decided that she wasn't gaining any weight. I think she probably weighed 30 pounds at that time, maybe
at 3 or
less.
4? Wow.
Yeah. Feeding time became so stressful for us because if you can't get enough nutrition in with your oral feeding, then she can't sustain, she can't grow, your brain's not nourished. There's just so much attached to poor nutrition that we tried everything through feeding therapy, adding butter. Like we would get those containers of the margarine that they would tell you and just like squeeze it into any type of soft food, your
We
yogurts.
squeezed in MCT oil. We got syringes and would
Yep.
squeeze it in.
And then Duocal,
Yeah,
it's a powder you add into anything soft like applesauce and yogurts, and we did a lot of yogurt at that time because it was easy for her to eat.
and she would swallow that safely,
Yeah,
yes.
and pudding, so adding any calories to those were how we were getting by, and then we did a swallow study, and she had dysphagia and had oral motor issues and low muscle tone, which she is overall anyways, so we just said, "Okay, it's time." And you kinda just you get to that point, you make the decision, and you just jump in.
You're
We
just
didn't
ready.
have the internet to the extent that we have now, so it's not like we could just go Google it or find To
A
Be
YouTube
Family,
video of how to do it.
yeah, and videos to show you what even to expect. They just tell you what's gonna happen, you're like, "Okay." The one thing I didn't expect was to leave the hospital with that huge, long gastric feeding tube.
Really, they didn't tell you about that as
I
much?
mean, they did, but I don't know, I just didn't expect it to be so long. I think I expected it just to be like the little, beach ball button, because that's what you're told that will eventually happen, so you don't really think about that in between, or at least I didn't. So I wasn't prepared in my mind. It wasn't so much that it was there, it was the fact that, okay, we were gonna have to send her to school with this
Exactly.
long tube or, just safely playing with the other kids or just being around the pets or you just don't know
You
what to
think
do
of
with it.
all these things once you see a
Yeah.
tube hanging out of your child's stomach.
So we end up just taking the tube and we would kind of wrap it up and we create a little bundle and elastic band it and stick it into her waistband. And at one point, I was even thinking, okay, I could probably sew little pockets in the top of her pants to tuck it into. But then at that point, we were
You were
ready for
almost
the
getting the Mickey
transition.
button.
Yeah. So, it's temporary, but I just didn't expect it.
I was just thinking when Hallie had her surgery as an infant, they had a balloon, and so every night you would have to get the Foley catheter, that long tube,
Mhm.
have to lightly tug on the tube on her stomach postoperatively and make sure there it was in place, and if it was getting loose, you added water to the balloon and you clean the tissue underneath. So every
Mhm.
night, John and I would go in together. And I remember we'd get so nervous and we'd lightly tug. And I said, well, what if one time it comes out? And he's like, don't talk like that. It's not going to happen. And we'd have all the med supplies on the
Mhm.
bed. And it was this big ordeal every night. And I remember I went to tug on it to check placement and it came out all the way. The balloon had popped. And we both looked in and John passes out at the sight of the blood. And we both looked in and you could see the inside of her stomach. And we're like, "Oh my god," and I panicked right then, and he took the Foley catheter, slid it back in, put gauze overneath, taped it on. This is all in one motion, gets it taped down, pulls her shirt down. She's like 5, 6 months old, throws her over his shoulder and says, "Grab my keys, head to the car." And we're walking to the car. I go, "Who are you on the phone with?" He's talking to the surgeon. They're like, "Meet us at the ER." This was in Nashville. And he got Hallie strapped in, and we start driving, and he looks at me and he says, "Do not mention anything that happened till we get to the ER." So I was like, "Okay." We get to the ER, the surgeon's waiting for us because it was so soon after surgery the tube could close.
Right.
So they're trying to get a new tube in, and I go, "John?" And he goes, "Uh-oh," and he sat down and passed out because he passed out the side of the blood, but he had held it together for so long, but as soon as somebody else had the baby.
Took control.
Yes, and I'm helping the surgeon, and it was a hot mess, but it's one of those memories you're like, "Oh, this is cute." So,
He does good in emergency
he does.
crisis,
I do
but
the
then when the
long turn.
crisis is done, he's down.
We call it the fainting goat in the family. Her feeding tube, though, they would have to go back in surgically to put a new one in, or they could do one slightly smaller. So we
Mhm.
decided not to do surgery again and do one slightly smaller. And then once that healed, about a month later, they went to take it out and put the Mickey button in, and it was too small. So they had to take a rod and open that hole. And it was so painful for
I
her.
was gonna say that sounds awful.
It was horrible, and they finally got the placement of the feeding tube, but they just didn't wanna put her under anesthesia again, and it was so traumatic. I cried, she cried. We get her home, we lay her down. I'm sleeping in a chair next to her in the living room. John's sleeping in the other room. And I remember I got up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom and I tripped over the feeding tube.
Gosh.
And it tugs and it was sore and the baby starts crying. I start crying again. John's like, "Oh my god, just stop crying." And he always could calm her down and do beatboxing and calm her down. But I was like, it was so much trauma those first few months of the feeding tube.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely a journey going from having that long tube and then going to the Mickey button. It took off all that stress of pulling it out or having accidents and things that you have no control over.
Right. And, like, I had more control over Hallie when she was a baby. You were sending Morgan to school
Yeah.
with this tube, and did they do feeds at the school, or did you just do them at night, or how did you do that?
No, we never did a continuous feed like 24 hours or any, like we do it over a period of time. So we were able to do it first thing in the morning, the hour before school. We take her to school. And then at that time, what we did, instead of keeping her there the whole day, we would pick her up earlier than the full school day so that we could accommodate for feeds.
Got
So then we did that. So it was always just a couple hours. And then eventually, over time, once we had the Mickey button in and we had it for a while, we ended up changing to 100% bolus feeds.
Oh,
And
okay.
pretty much that just means you have a tube that's connected to an extension you add in, and you just pour the formula in, and it just pulls by gravity. It was a better option for us based on scheduling and time. And I didn't like having her do feeds overnight because, they're notoriously pulling at them and then you have a whole mess. So I did not like overnight feeds. Yes, it was necessary, especially in the early days, so we could get those calories in and we could do more food over a longer period of time to help take the stress off during the day.
We only did nighttime feedings when Hallie was a baby and in a crib because they weren't
Yeah.
moving as much, but after that, we just did bolus. We called it her princess power milk because from, like, 1.5, she was into princesses, so she'd get excited to have her princess power milk.
Yeah. I just can't imagine having them do a continuous feed during the day when they're away from you, like at school.
Yeah, I didn't wanna do that either, and Hallie couldn't eat safely, so we didn't send her to two-year-old preschool, but at three-year-old preschool, we only let her go 3 hours, and she couldn't have
Mhm.
snack time with the kids because she couldn't swallow safely, and she was still doing the feeding tubes.
Will say once she was in elementary school, they did the feeds at lunch because they had the nurses on staff that were
Oh,
trained to
that's
do
nice.
that. So she did get to bed, at school.
I think we never had to do that. I think Hallie ended up getting her tube out right at kindergarten.
Yeah.
But, all these things we're talking about of having feeding tubes, it's not what's normal and what you expect for parenting. And
Yeah.
to me, when we were talking about doing this episode, I kinda got overwhelmed with different feelings I hadn't expected to kinda hit me when I started thinking about that time in our lives with her. Um, and I don't know about you, but for me, I felt a lot of grief over what I expected parenthood to be. I had had several friends who had babies the same year Hallie was born. Hallie was born June 2nd. One of my friends was in the same hospital and her child was born June 7th, like 5 days later. So I saw all these parents, breastfeeding their babies and going to play groups. And here I had a child failure to thrive with floppy airways and feeding tubes and therapy appointments and doctor's appointments. And I it just was overwhelming to me that I never had that normal experience, especially with your
Yeah.
first baby, and I felt like, "Is this motherhood?" Like, because I was looking at
Well, you didn't
myself.
know any better because you didn't
No,
have
we
she's your
didn't,
first.
but you see everybody else, and it was so
Yeah.
overwhelming, and I had these small windows where I felt seen as a mom, and other times where I felt like, on the outside of something bigger because everybody else had these, like, cool experiences with their children crawling and walking and talking and eating, and
Mhm.
mine wasn't doing any of that. But I remember when Hallie's about 7 months old, I was at Vanderbilt Medical Center waiting for an appointment, and I was sitting in the hall, and I had her cradled with the binky and the feeding tube
Yeah.
through her Mickey button, and I was just kinda cooing to her, and I was just talking to her like, "Hey,
Yeah.
here's your milk. I hope that's hitting your tummy," just like you would if you were breastfeeding.
Right.
And a speech pathologist walked down the hall and said, "You're feeding her beautifully." And I was like, oh, someone sees all the hard work we're putting in, and it was like, "Oh, at least in a hospital, this is like normalcy," and I felt like a mom, you know? But it was this hard thing because then I'd go through these bouts where I felt guilty for having a child who was different. Not that I didn't love Hallie,
Right.
I was embarrassed sometimes, and I it's really hard to say that out loud, but
Yeah.
I remember when she got the Mickey button and my mom had traveled for Thanksgiving, and she made us go to Chili's, and it was just me, Hallie, and my mom, and she's like, "You're gonna tube feed her in public." And I was out of my comfort zone, and Mama Donna was like, "You gotta do it while I'm here." And so I did, and I popped it open, and I connected the tube, the bolus tube, and I connected the syringe, and I pour the milk in, and all of a sudden, milk starts going everywhere. I forgot to close the Mediport, and I'm just like tears are going down my face, but I'm not crying out loud because I don't wanna scare the baby, and everybody's staring at us because there's, like, milk
Yeah.
spraying, and my mom's like, "It's okay," and my mom's like, "Close the Metaport, stop pouring the milk," and I was like, "Okay,"
Well, it's like
but it
how
was
many times did you go to put medicine in that port and the other one's open? You're like, "Oh, for God's sakes," and then you
and
waste your
then you miss
medicine
the
and
medicine and you're like, "How much went in? How much
yeah,
didn't?" Did you have
yeah.
any other, like when you're thinking about those early years or even now, what it was like for you or how you felt?
Yeah, there's I can think of a lot of different ones, but we would go to my son's baseball games. I'd always have him, the twins, and it was always chaotic and a lot. So I would get very overwhelmed at times, and I had to feed her because we'd be gone all day. There was a lot of times I would just take her to the car and do it in private because I just didn't know if people would, staring at us, it would make me uncomfortable or make them uncomfortable. And it wasn't that I was ashamed. I just wasn't ready for the questions or the attention. But something just shifted. At some point, I was like, you know what? I'm causing myself way too much anxiety. And I think I just became more confident,
Good
and
for you.
her feeding started to feel less like something I needed to hide. So I just started tubing her in the open. The one thing I found really interesting is you definitely feel other people looking at you.
Yeah,
You start hooking up this tube and you're pouring stuff, and they're like, what the hell is she doing? Where is that going? But some parents would glance over, look away, and then kind of look back. But the moments that I think stayed with me the most were the kids. They would just come over, sit with us, and start asking questions and talking to us like it was really no big deal. They
yeah.
were curious in the purest way of kids. They'd ask the best questions, very honest, thoughtful, and the biggest thing, without judgment. They just were curious.
And kids are amazing. They kinda take down that
Hmm.
barrier that other people wanna know what's going on, but they're just so innocent and curious, as you're saying, and it helps take down that barrier, and I know that helped us a lot too.
And I think adults don't want to ask you because they don't want to be rude. And I think that's what's so great about the kids is that
They're innocent.
they don't see it as different the way adults do. They just see it as another kid being cared for. To me, it was really cool just that awareness starts so young.
Yeah, and I think kids are innocent, and I think they're more accepting of all things and all people, and I found that when Hallie was young and we were tube feeding in public or had the apnea monitor go off, the kids were the ones who made it feel like she was part of the community. Like, they'd be
Yeah.
like, "Cute baby." And they would be like, "Oh, what's that?" And I go, "Oh, it's her Princess Power Milk," and we would talk about it, and it was wonderful to feel her accepted in that way from other
Mhm.
children.
Yeah. And I think at that point, that's when you realize that you are accepting this. It didn't mean that you would choose that. I don't choose to tube feed her and have a feeding tube, but it's what we needed to do as parents to help her thrive. And that was the only way to do that. So, it took time to accept that, but it's okay. It might take you 10 years to accept the fact that this is what our life is. Morgan's is a lifelong journey. It's not all of a sudden she's going to be like, hey, I'm going to start eating. It's just
It's
not
just
that
what
way for
she'll
us.
need. I think for us, the acceptance was pretty quick for the first feeding tube because
Mhm.
it was life and death. She was choking, and it was validating because I knew something was going on, and it was safety, and it was nutrition, and we instantly saw the impact it had on her. Like, she was getting healthy, she was getting bigger. I think for me, the hard acceptance was, she got her first feeding tube out at 5, and
Mhm.
then she got really sick at, like, 12, 13, and only she was 12, 13, 5'2", and weighed maybe 70 pounds. We just could not keep weight
Yeah.
on her. And finally, she wasn't processing foods properly, digesting solid foods, so she had to go on a full liquid diet, but she couldn't get all the calories in during the day, so we'd
Yeah.
had to do the feeding tube at night. So when she was the summer before high school, we had to put that second feeding tube back in, and that was a hard one for us because we're
Yeah.
like, "Is this the beginning of the end, or are we putting this in, and is it the right time to do this?" And she's gonna look different again, and she wants to be a pretty teenager and wear bikinis, and so that
Yeah.
was a hard acceptance for us and for her, but as soon as we did it and she felt whole again because she was getting the hydration she needed, she's like, "Okay,
Yeah.
this was the best
She was
decision."
feeling healthy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
or at least a little better. So
Right.
we got her to where she needed to be.
Right. Well, and like I said, nutrition is a huge impact on how your brain even functions as a whole.
Absolutely, and hydration alone is
Yeah.
critical because
And for us,
we
that's what keeps us in and out of a hospital is hydration.
and that was it for us. Hallie had been in the hospital so much in middle school, those 3 years. She had to be homeschooled for 1 year, and she's like, "I'd rather just get it and be able to go to high school and get fluids in me and stay healthier while I can," so
I think it's interesting too from that perspective that she was part of the decision making at that point. She advocated for herself. She knew that that's what she needed and she was able to convey that to you.
yeah, it was powerful for us, and we tried our best just to normalize the experience for her,
Mhm.
and of course, nothing went well that second feeding tube.
Of
We
course
got the
not.
we got the feeding tube placed, and then she was supposed to go to Camp Boggy Creek 2 weeks later. The couple days leading up to Boggy Creek, she's like, "Mom, my stomach's hurting." Dr. Wine said our GI was on vacation, so we took her to the back to one of the other people in the practice, and they're like, "It's really tender. If it's still giving her irritation, bring her in on Monday," and we made the appointment on Monday just in case. I remember she was in the bathtub, and she's like, "Mom, something's wrong with this tube. My belly's swelling. I'm not good. I can't go to Boggy Creek tomorrow," which is a camp for kids with medical issues. So we ended up going to the ER and they were like, "We're gonna admit her and run some tests," and they ran a dye through it, and the tube was dislodged, it was no longer in her abdomen. So we had been putting liquids in and it was seeping
Oh.
into the peritoneal space in her abdomen, but it wasn't in her stomach. So then they had to go in and do another surgery to place the Foley catheter back in where it was.
Mhm.
And this is like a week before school starts, and then she got to come home, then it started to dislodge again, and so she missed the first day of high school, and I remember thinking, "Oh my god, she really wants to be in high school," and she's like, "Well, I'm going to high school tomorrow." She's in the hospital, and she's like, "You better bring me clothes, I'm telling the doctor I'm going out." But then I thought, "How are we gonna get that long catheter
Yeah.
again under her clothes?" You know how I had that spy belt we bought,
Yeah,
like,
I still
years.
use mine.
Yeah, and it's the same one. God bless
Mhm.
Spy Belt. They're the best invention. I got to the hospital. She was already dressed. I had gone home to get a couple things. John had spent the night, and she
Yeah.
told the doctor, "I'm going to school." And she was only going half days in the afternoon. So I put the Spy Belt around her. We stuffed the tube in the zippered pocket, and she went
That's so
to high
smart.
school. Yeah, it was so
That
good.
was
And
clever.
no one could see it. She even went to homecoming, and she had a beautiful blue and silver homecoming dress, and there was a red spy belt underneath. You'd never know from the pictures, it was hidden well. But spy belt products are great for Foley
Yeah. They're
catheters.
great for diabetes projects too. They a
Oh,
lot
that's
of medical devices.
oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, looking back, I wish we had the feeding tube place that first year when we were originally scheduled. I think it would have taken a lot of stress off eating enough to sustain her because once it was in, I feel like our mealtime became just that. There was
Yeah,
time
that's
sitting, eating
beautifully said.
together, and it was for enjoyment, which family time comes with. eating your meals together, enjoying time together, not stressing about what she's putting in her mouth. It was a lot easier just to sit back and enjoy those times.
And not having to worry about how many calories she was eating, knowing you could fit that in at a later time.
Well, and that's like even now, she doesn't eat a lot. She'll graze, it just depends. And when she does, she just eats fruit with us, or sometimes she'll just have some mac and cheese. She doesn't eat a lot of it, but it's her time to sit with the family while we're all eating dinner, and she can be part of those conversations and
She's
just
part of the
the
meal.
fun that we have at dinner.
Well, and you guys still do Morgan Mondays where you go out with friends and it's going out to eat. Does she eat fries or something while
Yeah,
she's eating?
she likes French fries, tater tots. Sometimes we can get her to do chicken.
It's just for enjoyment and socialization because feeding is such a element of our culture, and meals are
Hmm.
such a part of family time and socialization.
Yeah.
And I think being able to have that feeding tube, like, as you said, takes that pressure off. So you can socialize and go out and go to Christmas parties with your family and know they're gonna get the nutrition they need, but they can still be included as part of the process.
And I think too, with having her being bolus fed,
Mhm.
we can take that stuff anywhere. So I whip it
Exactly.
at any restaurant, any place that we may be. We
You just
have
have
it
it in the
with
pack.
us at the beach. We have it in the back. We do our bolus feed and then we're done. So it definitely was a really good thing that we finally just did it. And like I
So
said, don't know why it took so long.
everybody's journey is the journey it is. But we did our
Yeah,
best just to normalize their childhood and their experience with the feeding tube so that it was, our kids weren't defined by their medical equipment. They were
right.
just our children. And Hallie had to have an IV pole from birth on for several years and at the end of life. And so when we had the IV pull out, it was for the feeding pump. And I
Hmm.
remember thinking, this has to be more childlike. So she was in the hospital getting the feeding tube, and I ran to a local Toys R Us and I bought this little purple elephant that you hang up and you pull at the bottom and it makes a song and the tail goes up.
Oh, yeah, I remember those.
So, and we named her Mabel, and she stayed on her IV pole for 5 years in her bedroom. And I still have Mabel. And when Hallie had to get the IV pole back in the room for feeding tubes and stuff in the last year of her life, she's like, "Do we still have Mabel?" Like, she had remembered Mabel,
That's
and we
funny.
brought it out and decorated her room with Mabel, so
Yeah. Well, and it's those things that you have to do to normalize what isn't normal.
yeah, yeah.
I do think it becomes second nature over time. It's scary at first, and don't go in with the plan that it's gonna be a forever thing. It might be temporary, but for us, it did become a forever thing, but like I said, just being able to take the stress off and give her the nutrition that her body needs to be able to function, survive, and fight all her immune system issues.
And it's a blessing to have it in many situations because it does keep them hydrated when you need it, and you know it can
Mhm.
avoid that ER visit, so you guys have been having a feeding tube for many years. Are there any tips or tricks you've learned along the way?
We never had luck with using the sodas and stuff because medication would clog. That's typically anytime we have a clog, it's from medication because you have a powder or something that just kind of pools and just hardens real fast. But we learned over time that if we put the medication in and if all of a sudden it just stops and there's nothing happening, I have her stand up real fast and I tilt the the syringe, you tilt it sideways, and gravity will pull everything down, and all of the stuff comes out that was clogging the tube, and then I have her sit down real fast, and I push it back up, and then it flows right through.
So you use gravity and Morgan's positioning
Yeah,
to help with
20
the
years
medicine.
it took to figure that one out, because normally, we would panic because now it's clogged, and once it's clogged, because we had this one medication that, um if it was the generic version versus the brand, huge difference because the brand would actually dissolve like it was supposed to, where the generic version doesn't do that. So the generic would clog it. So then we learned that we had to ask for brand only instead of
And
the
that
generic.
would
So
go
we'd have
through
to go
her
through prior
G-tube
auth
better.
because of that. But other than that, they'd be replacing a new Mickey button every time it clogs.
Yeah, yeah, and those are
But
expensive.
But what about did you have any of those aha moments when you were feeling Hallie that made everything feel less overwhelming?
Yeah, we had a couple of things that really helped that we learned along the way. Because she had the Nissen fun duplication, she couldn't burp as easily to get the gas
Mm,
off her belly. So once we hook up a feeding tube, before we'd put the formula in, I would massage her lower belly below the belly button with
mm,
the tube hooked up, and it would like allow burps to come out through the syringe and through
yeah,
the tube. So that always got some of the gas off her stomach before I put the milk in or the
mhm,
formula in. So that was always helpful, or if she was not feeling well or refluxing, I could just air out her belly and let some
yeah,
of that gas off her stomach, which was big for her.
yeah, we
One
would do that too.
yeah, because it's a huge difference. It was like, how do other people burp babies? It took me a while to learn
Yeah.
to burp kneeling because I
Well,
used the
even
feeding tube.
now, I hook the tube up and I open the valve, and it's so funny, all this air comes out, and it'd be like, "Why isn't she complaining that her belly's upset if all this air's
Air
coming
is
out?"
on there, yeah. Well, we used to think, "Oh, wow, this is so great. It makes life easier for us and for her," but
Yep. Well, they used
one
to
of the
vent it in the hospital too, which I didn't realize that you could just leave it vented and they would just put a little diaper on the end.
we did that at home quite often.
Mm,
When she especially when she would be sick, we'd add the tube
mhm,
and put a diaper around it and let it air out during the day to
yeah.
kinda help her tummy rest, but when one thing we learned was how positioning the tube at night was important and could
Mm,
affect her. When Hallie was, like, a year and a half, we would have little jammies that button up from the toe to the top, and I remember we had put Hallie down for the night, and we had the baby monitor on, and I started to doze off, and over the baby monitor, I heard my grandma Edith say, "Jilly, Jilly, come now." And only that family
yeah.
always called me Jilly. She had died 6 years earlier, and I jumped out of bed and
My
ran to Hallie's room, and the feeding tube was wrapped around her neck about to pull
gosh,
tight, and I was like, "Oh my
that's
god, my dead
scary.
grandmother just warned me." But I never even thought of how I positioned the tube, and Hallie was a wiggle worm when
Mm,
she was little. That night, I took it off. I was, like, crying, of course, because 'cause I'm a crier,
yeah.
and John's like, "We've gotta feed her," so we bolused her a little, and each of us would bolus every hour, and we're like, "This is
Mhm,
ridiculous. We're not gonna be able to do this." So, we started thinking about it, and I was like, "Well, if I thread the feeding tube through her leg, and then I
mm,
got a little piece of Velcro and lightly Velcroed the tube around her foot area, and
mhm,
then it positioned there, so no matter if she wiggled, the tube was always down her pants and on her foot away from her head. So no one had taught us how to loop a tube down a pant leg to
right.
keep it from getting around the baby. So that was one we had to learn. I did the unclogging with sparkling water or Sprite. That was another trick. I know I'm kind of going from trick to trick, but one thing that it didn't work for you guys, but for Hallie,
Yeah.
um, we'd have ice cold Sprite in the fridge, and we'd get a little syringe and fill it with ice cold Sprite and squirt it in her tummy, and she would giggle having those cold bubbles on her tummy. She thought
Yeah.
it was funny.
Yeah, it's funny how some tricks work for some things. It probably is what was the original reason it was clogged. Probably has a big reason why one thing or another
Exactly.
didn't work. So it's always good to get lots of tips and try to find those tips.
Because you gotta just try out what's gonna work for your kiddo and see.
Yeah, but when you talked about the clothing, it brings me back to when Morgan was younger. I really wish that there was clothing lines available for kids that had feeding tubes. Because for a baby, you are stripping them down. I wish that I had thought of it creating almost like a port that you could have just peeled off, like a
Yeah.
Velcro thing, and access the port and then cover it back up instead of having to
The
undress
whole
them, make
jammies.
them
Yeah,
cold, and waking them up if you're doing it in the middle of the night. But I no. Now there are a lot more adaptable clothing, but back then there was nothing. And like having little pockets, like you got the spy belt. So the spy belt was something that you could use where when Morgan was younger, if I just had like little pockets in the clothing or something that could have been velcroed to clothing, things like that would have made life a lot easier when they were
yeah.
little.
Yeah, and I felt like almost an engineer at times because 'cause you'd have to just rig something up to work in that moment you needed for, whether it be jammies in the tube or you have a new baby you're taking care of and you gotta hook up a feeding tube and you'd prop it against something. I
Yeah.
think that it's really great to see such inclusivity in clothing lines and
Hmm.
adaptable equipment and things that are allowing families to feel part of society by having more inclusive things.
Yeah. And as we've learned through time, all these little things we've learned has helped build confidence to be able to try new ways to declog something or work through where are we going to put this tube or how are we going to access this tube. But it just comes from small lived in lessons.
100%, 100%. And just to say, this is really just our personal experiences. It's not medical advice. It's just 2 moms sharing what worked for us and for our kiddos. But remembering that every tube and every child is different, and it's always okay to check in with your medical team about what's right for your family and for your kiddo. And
Yeah.
before we share the next part of this podcast, we wanted to gently say that the next section includes reflection on food, eating, and family dynamics. And we're sharing this next section from a place of honesty and growth, not from blame or guilt. If this brings up feelings for you, please know you're not alone and it's okay to take a pause right now. I know this is a section that was deeply important to you, so I'm going to kind of let you get started.
Well, and it's funny as I was going back through all these memories from when they were kids and, just the stress of dinner time. I've been thinking a lot about how that worked in our family with the feeding tubes and acceptance. And because feeding Morgan was always so difficult, we're always worrying about calories, the weight gain, failure to thrive. It felt like feeding became this constant stressor built around mealtime.
Yeah, it wasn't just one part of the day, it was always on our mind because you were so worried when your kiddo's failure to thrive, you're
Hmm.
constantly thinking of how to fit the next calories and in their diet.
Yeah. It's hard to even explain how stressful that is, and when I look back, I realize I never really learned how to feed my other kids
Mhm.
because feeding stopped being about nourishment or enjoyment. It became this big project, just get everyone fed. So it kind of led to, like, whatever Morgan was eating, regardless of how healthy it may or may not be, I was giving to everyone, and I was just glad everyone was eating.
Well, that makes complete sense because you were in survival mode for so long with Morgan and still are, but what was that like?
Well, I think during that time, and even now, I reflect back and I was so grateful that Morgan we'd eat anything. I'm still that way. So I didn't push variety as much as I wish I did because we tried early during feeding therapy. We would try all these different things, but she wouldn't take to them or it was just too hard for her to maneuver in her mouth. So I didn't focus on the balanced meals necessarily. I stuck to what she would eat because it felt safer like McDonald's. She would eat the nuggets, the french fries, and she would
Wow.
drink the milk. So for me, it it was
That was safe.
survival felt more
Yeah.
important than doing what was maybe the most nutritious.
Well, and I'm just hearing that meal, and as a mom with a kid who has failure to thrive, I'm like, "That's great calories." You
Right,
don't
right.
always think about the healthiest option when you're like, "I'm getting calcium in them, I'm getting some protein, I'm getting some fats," and when you're constantly worried, "Is your child getting enough?" It changes how you see food entirely.
Yeah, it really does. Because over time, that approach, it affected our whole family's relationship with food. Treats became rewards, food became comfort, celebration, and a relief that they were eating. I can't tell you how many times we would just go through Campbell's dairy aisle to go get an ice cream because we had a great day, we were out for the day, let's go get something to eat. So my initial reaction was, let's go get a treat. But ironically enough, Morgan wouldn't participate in the ice cream part. And if I was feeling guilty that, okay, we had to spend the last 8 hours at All Children's at the infusion clinic, I wanted to be able to do something for the other kids because they sat through that and they were good. And so you're rewarding them, but you're rewarding them with not maybe the best choices.
Yeah, and for me, it was like there was so much focus on food, and it
Hmm.
was comfort. It was relief that they're finally eating when Hallie finally got to eat. And I think a lot of parents listening now may have that same feeling. I remember when Hallie was 3.5 and just learning to eat, I was so excited to not have to rely on the tube. I
Hmm.
wanted to do something normal with her. It sounds weird, but I wanted to take her to McDonald's and buy her a Happy Meal. And she
It's
just
because
wasn't.
that's what other moms did with their
Yes.
kids. Like that was what was normal.
And it was a fun, easy thing.
Yeah,
You take your kids, they play in the play area. You go with all moms groups would go to a McDonald's
yeah,
or a Chick-fil-A, but I just wanted to be part of that group of moms who could take their kids and do a normal activity. We didn't get there until Hallie was about 4 or 5. She'd finally
mhm,
be able to eat a Happy Meal. But I didn't focus on those healthy choices, kinda like you're saying, it was often as anything we could get her to consume that was caloric, but it was also that normal thing. I had been watching these other parents take their kids to McDonald's or Chick-fil-A, and I was so excited for that. And that's what I and the other 2 came along too, right? And you're like, "Oh,
yeah,
wow, the second one's eating. Look at how much
right.
they're eating."
Well, and that's the hard thing is that we spent all the early childhood and with our first, we were so stressed about what they ate and how they ate and if they'd eat. And once they grabbed onto something, you were like, we're all going now.
Yes.
So, McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's, those places became more of a staple in their everyday diet because number one, it was easy because half the time we're on the road, either
You're
with
always heading to the
baseball or
hospital or the
soccer or
doctor.
hospital or therapy, you're always
Therapy.
out.
Yes.
So, and over time though, when my younger daughters in middle school and high school, especially after puberty time, their weight became a concern. I remember every time we go to the doctors, they'd be like, "Ooh, they're kind of creeping up," and they would be considered in the overweight or getting closer to the obesity side. No, it's really hard to sit back and reflect now that I contributed to that and their struggles with their weight and how they ate and what they ate sits on me.
That's such a hard thing to name out loud.
Yeah. It is, and I don't wanna say I blame myself because, I was doing the best I could with, you know, fear, and I thought I was doing the right thing at the time because it was better than not eating. I go between, "This is what's easy for right now,"
Right.
versus, "They don't eat." So, I don't know.
I you were just in survival mode. Many times you were in survival mode. It doesn't mean you failed. It just means you showed up the only way you could at that moment, right? You were doing the
Yeah,
best you could. We both were. And we can always look back and think, what could we have done differently? And I'm sure there are things, but at the same time, we have to remember that's where we were in that moment. And we were under a considerable amount of stress at
right.
that time.
And I think that's what I've learned through this whole challenge with feeding tubes is that feeding challenges don't just affect one child, they ripple through the entire family. And hopefully, with awareness, it will allow us to heal, relearn, and approach food with more compassion and not blaming ourselves. Like you said, we were in survival mode. We were just doing the best that we could do at that time. I just wish I did some things a little different.
Sometimes maybe we have to give ourselves some grace for the seasons that we're just about surviving, as we said. If there's one thing that we hope we can take from this conversation, or at least I'm going to take from this
Hmm.
conversation, and I hope others may be able to, parenting kids with complex medical issues, parenting in survival mode doesn't mean that we failed. It means we showed up for the best way we could in a really hard time in our kids' lives and in our
Hmm.
lives. And as I've always told my kids as they've gotten older during all this chaos and in that moment, I would always say, "I will pay for your therapy later in life." And I am, for sure,
Yeah,
because
yes.
having those siblings and all my kids have chronic medical issues, but Hallie's was most severe and took us away from the family a lot, and she passed away and all those types of things. I knew it was impacting my other kids, and I did my best to balance everybody, but we can only do so much, and there's other people that are gonna be in their lives to support them, and one of those is their counselor.
Yes, thank goodness for them. Well,
Yeah.
and I think it allows the other kids to help them come to grips with how the feeding tubes or their siblings with the disabilities affected them and how they can move forward and come to a safe acceptance. And I guess that's all we can do, all we can hope.
Absolutely, and hope such a key critical role in raising kids with medical challenges, especially
Yeah.
feeding tubes, because there's gonna be days where we feel like we're doing everything wrong or that we forgot to close the Metaport and milk's flying everywhere. Days the feeding tube clogs or it pops out. Days where we just feel like we're surviving, but it's still a beautiful story. It does not define our family. It does not define our child. It's just part of their journey. And looking back, I have so many fond memories of our feeding challenges and all the things that gave us Hallie for 15 years on this earth. And if it wasn't for that feeding tube, we wouldn't have had her that long.
That's very true perspective. Talking about how feeding challenges ripple through the whole family reminds me how much of this journey I've had to learn as I go.
Hmm.
Like we were saying, when she first had her tube put in, I had this big long tubing that I had no idea what to do with. And I feel like I didn't think past each moment until I got into that next step. And I
Right.
didn't think about the day to day care or the fact that I'd be changing her tube every few months. No one really showed me how to do it. The doctor's office didn't walk me through it. I think the equipment company just sent one to me. But it's funny how you fixate on the immediate crisis and don't realize what's
Oh.
coming next. And that's where community changed everything for me because when it came to change Morgan's tube for the first time, I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. And then in walked Jill with her basket of supplies.
I remember that, but probably not as well as you do because you were in the crisis mode of, "Oh god, I gotta change it the first time." I remember that, though. I think Morgan was, like, 4 or 5,
She was 4.
4, and our
I
girls
think
were in
so.
BPK at Chimino Elementary, and Hallie still had her feeding tube. She was able to eat safely then, but I was so scared to take it out yet. And by then, we had been doing it for 4 years, and to me, such an honor to be able to share in something I learned from raising Hallie with you and Morgan, and I was just grateful to know another family that had similar experience as ours, and it was nice for Hallie to have a friend who had a Mickey button, and for the siblings, for Neely to see, "Oh, look, there's another little girl like Hallie who has a feeding tube." And I think I was just honored to be part of the first of Morgan's tube journey.
It's probably one of my earliest memories of us and our friendship. It was so significant, but I also wonder, like, how did it feel for you to be coming over to someone else's house and changing their daughter's Mickey button? Were you scared at all? I think I'd be a little
No,
nervous
I
because
had
it was
helped
someone else's
another
kid.
when we were living in Clearwater, I had a friend over there, Laura, who had a little one, and he had to have his Mickey button changed out for the first time. So I went over and changed it out and taught her how to do it. So you were actually the second family I got to help. I kind of feel like it's a little trauma bonding. I'd been doing it for so many years, it was just second nature, but I could tell you were a little nervous the first time. And I was just so excited to have a friend who got it.
Yeah.
You got what it was like to have kids who had medical issues, and it is such a different perspective that it's not all gymboree and play groups as much as we want them to, I love those things, but, you were another mom who went to therapy all the time and had feeding tubes. I was just yeah, it was like trauma bonding. And I feel like when I came over to your house to change out that Mickey button for Morgan, I was just like, we found our friend group. It was like, I felt like you were a real friend that day. Like,
A
this was
membership
gonna
of
be
2.
yeah, we never got beyond 2. It was
No,
just
we
us.
we
It
tried
was
to pick
just
up
us.
some here and there, but didn't stick.
No, no, we try, but hopefully through this podcast, we'll get a bigger community and say, "Hey, you're a to-be mom or a to-be dad, we're here for you." But yeah, it was a beautiful step in our journey with you in the medical world, so
Well, we had both just stepped into this whole world of medical parenting. We didn't have everything figured out, but we understood what it meant to be in this role as a parent.
there was this, I think, unspoken understanding between us that you don't
Mhm.
have to explain everything. If you get quiet or you don't wanna talk about it, or if you're just upset one day, you just get it. Yeah, that's really important to me in this friendship.
Well, and it's funny, I think you've said it before, is even through this podcast, there's so many stories between the 2 of us that we've never even talked about or said
I
before. And
know.
it's kinda crazy that over 20 something years,
We're
we
finally
would have
sharing
had
this.
those conversations But it's like you said, we weren't ready to talk about it, or we've kind of moved on from that because we had to. But it's been an honor to be able to support each other during a time that was really hard.
Yeah.
And, it's like I said, it's one of my first memories of our friendship was you coming over, but it wasn't even about you coming and doing it. I guess it was that you showed up and you knew how to show up in a way that other people didn't know how.
Yeah, I think just sitting in it together, learning as we went, like, it was nice to know I wasn't alone in that journey, that there were times I could call in somebody else to be like, "Hey, help. What did you do
Exactly.
in this?"
Well, and I think too is other friends would be calling, being like, "Oh my gosh, Joey walked today." I didn't have those moments when Morgan was little. I mean, yes, we celebrated those moments when they happened, but they were much more private because they were so much later than everyone else. So it's like sitting in those hard moments, we were able to remind each other that we weren't alone. And I think for me, that kind of support, and still to this day, that support just makes things easier. It lifts something that sits heavy.
I think you're my community, and community changes everything.
Yeah, it does. And I think that's what I hope people take from this episode and our all of our episodes, is that while feeding tubes and medical care can feel overwhelming, friendship and shared understanding can carry you through in ways that you don't always expect.
Absolutely. And no one is meant to walk this medical journey alone. I'm just so appreciative for our listeners. I just want to thank them for sitting with us in this conversation because this is therapeutic for me to talk through it in hopes that it helps somebody else.
Hmm.
Feeding tubes have brought up many emotions because it began in the beginning of Hallie's life and in the end of her life. And with those feeding tubes came fear and grief, relief and strength and hope and closure for us. And
Yeah.
all of those emotions are valid.
Well, and I just know for us, even recently, that if we didn't have her feeding tube over the last couple months, we would have spent a lot of time in the hospital. That it did help take off the stress. So if you're walking this path, we hope you've heard something today that made you feel a little less alone and maybe a little more confident in your choices. Feeding tubes are tools, they're not failures. And our kids are so much more than the equipment that helps them thrive.
And it is pretty cool equipment, though. I do say so myself. I just hope our listeners know if this episode resonated with you, we'd love for you to share it with someone who might need it right now. And to every To Be family listening, we see you. We're going to post a few pictures this week of our own kiddos in their tubing journey. So check us out on Instagram and TikTok at Strength Happens Real 3. This is Strength Happens.